So we're in Matthew chapter 8, and we're looking at verses 1 to 4. Just going to look at a few verses. And this is about when Jesus meets a leper. And the reason why this will be helpful today is because often we don't know the right attitude we should have towards Jesus. And that's the same for non-Christians and for Christians. People don't really know what attitude we should have to Jesus. So we're going to look at that today, find some answers to that. And sometimes we don't really know what Jesus' attitude is towards us. Some people think Jesus hates them, or that Jesus don't really like them too much, or that Jesus doesn't care about them. And oftentimes we don't really properly understand what Jesus' attitude towards us is. So we're going to look at that as well. So everything today should help us understand Jesus better and have a relationship with him better. But because we're looking at leprosy today, we're looking at a leper, it'd be worth just doing a bit of background in what leprosy is, right? These days, when we say leprosy, does anyone know what the name of that disease is? Hansen's disease, named after a guy who discovered it in the 19th century called Hansen. And in biblical times, leprosy actually had a much broader range than what it does today. So back then, leprosy was a whole bunch of skin conditions. So it wasn't just Hansen's disease, what we know today. But it could be as bad as Hansen's disease. And with Hansen's disease, you could actually have the case where you've got tumor-like growths swelling up on your face. And what can also happen is that you get nerve damage in your hands so that you can't actually feel things, which means your hand could be in fire and burning and you wouldn't even feel that. So lepers were quite at risk of injury to themselves because they could be injuring themselves and not even feel it. And what would happen is that the tissue in between the bones in the hands and the feet would start disintegrating. It's pretty terrible disease, which would lead to a lot of deformities. But as bad as that is, the worst thing about it for Jewish people in biblical times was that it made them ceremonially unclean. And if you've been reading Leviticus in the last week, as part of our Through the Bible reading plan, then you'll understand what that's about. People who had leprosy had to leave the camp. Now, what was in the camp? The tabernacle, which showed there was the presence of God. So they had to move away from the presence of God, and they had to move away from the presence of all the other people, so that their leprosy would not spread onto other people. Okay, as far as we know, there was no healing for leprosy in biblical times. So what would happen is the law was just set up to say, okay, you guys have got to leave the camp now. They become social outcasts. No one would talk to them. No one would get even close to them. They had to walk around, and if someone got close, they had to say, unclean, unclean, just to warn them, stay away. So you could imagine what your life would be like being a leper. And people considered lepers as cursed by God. So you just think of the person you know who's the most unpopular person you know in your area, and that person probably isn't even close to how a leper would have felt. Now, with that background knowledge, let's go into the story. Matthew 8, verse 1. Remember, he's just done the Sermon on the Mount, and Matthew says, after he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Now, this is a clue that there's going to be trouble later, right? Because remember, the land is not being run by the Jews at the moment. Who's it being run by? The Romans, right? So the Romans are in control of the area, and they got to keep an eye out for civil unrest. So you can imagine, suddenly you see this guy walking down a mountain, loads of crowds following him. Like, imagine these days if you saw a guy walking down Wandsworth High Street and like 500 people marching behind him. Someone's going to phone the old Bill, and they're going to say there's something going on here, you know. So this is a clue that there's going to be trouble later on, because people are going to be like, what's going on here? But that ain't going to happen for a while, so we won't go there yet. But just bear this in your mind. This is a clue something else is going to happen later. Now, moving on, verse 2. And a leper approached and bowed low before him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, what we're going to do here to start off with is look at the leper's attitude towards Jesus. And then we're going to look at Jesus' attitude to the leper. So first off, looking at the leper, notice how the leper approached Jesus, right? The leper approached Jesus. And it's a wonderful thing to approach Jesus. And many times in the Gospels, you'll see when people approach Jesus, they get blessed for it. And I think it's worth making this point because normally we go wrong when we don't approach Jesus. Think how many problems people have got. You hear in Roehampton all the time, many problems people have got. And many times they haven't approached Jesus. And you can ask people, say, have you approached Jesus? That's what the leper did here. He approached Jesus. He went to Jesus. And I think that we often don't go to Jesus enough times. And many times it's because we think we're terrible sinners. Just like this leper could have thought, oh, I'm an unclean leper. We can think, we're too sinful. We can't go to Jesus. Like, I'll give you an example. Sometimes you can find yourself watching a film that you know you shouldn't really watch. Might be really violent, might be really dark, might be kind of warped. And for some reason, you carry on watching it. And then afterwards, you kind of had this bad feeling in your head. Anyone kind of felt that way? You're like, I shouldn't have watched that. That hasn't edified me in any way. And then you think, I should go and pray now. But you start thinking, well, I should wait a few minutes before I pray because I'm kind of not really right with God right now because this film has messed up my head. And then you think, no, I'll just wait a minute and then I'll pray. You know, or you might sin and then you'll be like, I shouldn't pray just yet. I should wait a minute. We find ourselves doing this, and what we're doing is we're not approaching Jesus. Whereas really what we should do is just approach Jesus straight away. Even if you're a leper, covered in leprosy, you can still approach Jesus. So, this is what the leper does, and he has wonderful results from it. But let's see a bit more about his attitude here, right? Notice how he bowed low, which showed complete dependence on God. He bowed low, and it showed complete dependence on God, because it says, and a leper approached and bowed low before him. Now, the word bowed low, in the Greek, it's proskuneo, okay, proskuneo, and in Bauer's lexicon, right, in his Greek dictionary, it says this, to express in attitude or gesture, one's complete dependence on or submission to a high authority figure. So it's to express in attitude or gesture one's complete dependence on or submission to a high authority figure. So this leper, by bowing down low, in those times, in that culture, he's saying, I am completely dependent on you, Jesus. Now, it might well be that he doesn't really know that Jesus is God at this stage. But he probably does think he's the Messiah, because not everyone thought the Messiah was actually going to be God, but they knew it'd be a man. But regardless of that, he's going to Jesus and he's saying, I'm completely dependent on you. Now, this is important because, has anyone ever heard that saying, oh, God helps those who help themselves? Yeah. Some Christians say that phrase, but it doesn't say it anywhere in the Bible. And here you got an example of someone who can't help themselves, and they're going to Jesus and they're saying, I'm completely dependent on you. No one else can help me but you. So this is the attitude of the leper. And sometimes we think we can handle life on our own. Like, we think we can go to work without having prayed first. We can do outreaches without praying. We try to handle disputes with other people without praying. And often we try to do 18 hours of activity each day based on just a few minutes prayer. And by doing that, we're not really being like this leper who bowed down low and said, I'm completely dependent on you. Instead, we're saying, no, I can kind of manage it. I just need a little bit of help from Jesus. But I think instead we should be saying, Jesus, I need a lot of help from you. So far we've seen that the leper approached Jesus, and then he bowed down low, showing that he was completely dependent on Jesus. And what he also does is he recognizes that Jesus had the power to heal him. He recognizes that Jesus has the power to heal him. Check it out. A leper approached and bowed low before him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. So he says, you can make me clean. Now, as I say, he might not have realized that Jesus was actually God. But he probably did recognize he was the Messiah, because Jesus has gone around healing loads of people. And here he's calling him Lord, Some people try and translate it as sir, but it's unlikely because he actually bowed down before him. So he recognizes that Jesus is healing people and has the power to heal him. And he says, you can make me clean. Or you could say, you have the power to make me clean. And I think it's important to get this in our thick skulls, because sometimes we forget that Jesus has the power to deal with our situations. As Matthew Henry said, and this is a loose paraphrase of what he said, God would not appoint a doctor in his hospital who was not well qualified. Yeah? God wouldn't appoint a doctor in his hospital who wasn't well qualified. In other words, God wouldn't send Jesus to us if Jesus wasn't really able to deal with all our problems. And sadly, though, often people think Jesus can't deal with their problems because people think my problems are too complicated. They're too deep for Jesus to deal with. And that's why sometimes people go to psychologists, because they think Jesus can't help them. They think they need to see a psychologist. Or sometimes people deal with problems with dishonest ways because they think the Christian way won't work properly. They need to do their own thing. So the next time you find yourself in a difficult situation, remind yourself that Jesus has the power to deal with it. But at the same time, remember that Jesus is not a genie in a bottle. Yeah, notice what the leper says, right? Before he says, you can make me clean, what else does he say? If you are willing, okay? So what he's doing here, rather than treating Jesus as a genie in a bottle who pops out and he's got 3 wishes, instead he's saying, you can do it, but it's up to you if you're willing, okay? So what he's doing here is he's submitting himself to Jesus' will, right? The leper is submitting himself to Jesus' will. So it appears there's 2 things going on here. The first is the leper has the faith that Jesus can heal him. First thing, he has the faith that Jesus can heal him. But the second thing is he recognizes that it's up to Jesus' will whether he's healed or not. So it's up to Jesus' will if he gets healed or not. And this is important because some people these days think that you can bully Jesus into doing things for you. There's some guys that when they pray, they say, I decree it and I declare it, it is so. And they think if they use that special technique, they're going to force Jesus to do something. Or maybe they think it's nothing to do with Jesus. Maybe they think they're so powerful, they're doing it. I don't know. But there's also a lot of books people write about how to pray. And they kind of imply that you have to pray a certain way, otherwise your prayers won't get answered. Or you need a specific prayer strategy, otherwise your prayers won't get answered. And some people even say that you should never pray this prayer when you say, Jesus, if it's your will, heal me. Some people say, no, I don't do that because then you don't have faith. But what we see in this story is that the leper has faith, but at the same time says, Jesus, if it's your will, heal me. Now, did the leper get healed? He did. He did. So it's nonsense when people say, oh, if you pray that prayer, your prayers won't get answered. There's nothing wrong with praying it at all. You can still have faith that it will happen, but what you're doing is you're not making a presumption about Jesus' will. Instead, you're saying, Jesus, it's your will. It's up to you. Now, there's a well-known Greek grammar book by a guy called Max Zerwick, and he interprets this verse as saying this: if ever you wish, you can at any time cleanse me. In other words, I trust you will have mercy on me in your own good time. I trust you have mercy on me in your own good time. Now, I don't know if this interpretation is correct, but I think the attitude is a good attitude to have. When we want healing for something, we can pray, God, please heal me. I know you can heal me. If it's your will, you'll heal me now. But I trust you will have mercy on me in your own good time. Maybe you're going to heal me now, maybe in 3 months' time, maybe not till I get my resurrected body. We all know we're going to get healing ultimately at the end of it, and it's up to God's timing when he's going to do it. A bit like the other week when we looked at that verse when God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. You know, sometimes we don't get a healing, and it's important that we don't make presumptions on Jesus and try and treat him like a genie in a bottle with 3 wishes. And instead, we just say, look, Jesus, if you wish, you can cleanse me. You can heal me at any time. By the way, the reason why it's the word cleanse is because in those times, leprosy made you unclean, according to the law in Leviticus. So when you were healed from it, you were called cleansed. That's why it's called that. Now, do you remember last week when we were studying the kingdom of God, we saw that the kingdom of God is both present, but it's also what? Future. So it's already now, but it's also not yet. Okay? And we can take healings in the same way, where we can think, you know what? Jesus can heal me now, but he might choose to heal me in the future. It might happen when I get my resurrected body. When you get a resurrected body, you're not going to have sickness, as far as we know. So sometimes we just got to be patient. But the main thing is have the same attitude this leper has. So let's recap over the leper's attitude. First thing, he approaches Jesus. So we can learn from that. We can make sure that we're approaching Jesus as much as possible. In the morning, in our lunch break, whenever. Next thing, he showed complete dependence on Jesus. Like for our lives, are we trusting completely in Jesus? Or are we trusting on other things? Money that people will give us, money from work, our jobs, our bosses, our qualifications, whatever it is, our friends. Or are we showing complete dependence on Jesus? Next thing is, he recognized that Jesus had the power to heal him. This is really important. Even in Alcoholics Anonymous, they recognize this to an extent where they say that only a higher power can help them. Trouble is, not enough of them recognize Jesus as the higher power. But it's important to realize we can't deal with our own problems, but Jesus can. Next thing, he submitted to Jesus' will. So at the end of the day, just like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane said, not my will, but yours be done. Now, the text doesn't specifically say that the leper has done all the right things. Okay, we have to be careful with narrative from seeing what someone did and then saying, oh, those are all the things we should do. But what we do know is that the leper gets healed. So it seems like a pretty good guideline to say that these things are okay to do. Now let's look at the things that Jesus does. Verse 3, he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be clean. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Now, what do you think would be the thing that would really shock the crowds here? That's right. He touched him. If you touch a leper, you're in danger of catching leprosy. Plus, you're probably not really going to want to touch someone who's got really bad leprosy. They're probably not going to look too attractive. And yet here, Jesus reaches out and touches them. So, I don't know if you've noticed, but American TV shows, people are always better looking than English TV shows. Anyone notice that? I think it's because the Americans have worked out that people like to look at attractive people. You know, is it in English films, even the people aren't as attractive, but in American films, most people look like models. And it seems that we would rather look at someone who's really attractive than someone who isn't. But Jesus isn't like that at all. Because here he goes up to this leper, and I'm thinking that this leper probably doesn't have a mild skin condition. Because the fact that he's asking Jesus to heal him and that it's a big deal, I'm guessing that he might well have had Hansen's disease, what we know as leprosy today. So he could have had these huge growths all over his face, could have had a lot of deformity in his hands, and might not have walked too good. And Jesus goes up to him and touches him. Now just think for a minute, if you saw that guy, like if you're on the bus and that guy comes and sits next to you, how are you going to feel? Like, are you going to say, all right, mate, and put your hand out and shake hands? Just put your hand up, anyone who'd do that. No, I didn't think so. Well, maybe one person. You might have to see the doctor afterwards if you get leprosy. Now, we're probably not going to want to touch them too much. We might even think, you know, I should show love to this person, but I don't really feel like it too much. Obviously, the fact that Jesus touched him shows Jesus loved this guy, and Jesus had compassion for this guy. You know, he touched the leper, so this shows compassion. That's the kind of guy Jesus was. Now, I think there's an implication here that we should try to be more like Jesus. But obviously, you've got to bear in mind there are health implications. Like, we are not Jesus, so it could be we touch someone with leprosy, we could end up catching leprosy. Just like if someone injures themselves and there's blood everywhere, you might want to put gloves on your hand before you touch them, just to be safe. But at the same time, there's a lesson here that we should still show people love. So it might be in our lives, someone might come into our lives who seems a bit like a leper, like a modern day equivalent of what a leper was like then. And we might think, oh, I don't want to touch them. I don't want to reach out to them. But Jesus would have done that. So we should make sure we're doing the same. All right, guys? So let's try and be more like Jesus. I really hope that our church doesn't end up becoming an upper class church where we all come from humble backgrounds, but then we start thinking we're more important than we really are, and then we don't reach out to people from our same humble beginnings. I know a lot of people who've left our estate who've done that, who then later they said, nah, I'm better than Roehampton. People who won't even talk to their family now. People in my extended family who've done that and said, no, I'm better now. I hope we never end up like that. And I hope that if people come our way that need help, like this leper did in the story, that we then don't say, nah, you know what, I don't really want to get close to that person because I'm better. And I've noticed that we can do that a lot as Christians as well, where we get saved and then we look at sinners and we think, nah, I don't want anything to do with them. And we forget that we were once a sinner and we needed people to reach out to us as well. So I think it's just a little warning here for us as a church to not forget where we come from and to be like Jesus. And if a leper comes into your life, reach out and touch them and show love to that person. Could be, we could have someone walk through the door, could be an alcoholic or a drug addict, and we might think, they smell a bit funny. But would Jesus be like that? Or would Jesus be like putting his hand out and wanting to heal them? I think he probably would. So let's try and be more like Jesus. Now, let's see what else Jesus did. He stretched out his hand and touched him. He touched the leper, saying, I am willing, be clean. Immediately, his leprosy was cleansed. So he said, I am willing, right? Jesus wanted the leper to be healed. So that shows us that Jesus cares because he wanted the leper to be healed. Now, it's an obvious point, but I think it's worth spending a minute thinking about it because we can forget that Jesus cares for us. Like, we probably all recognize that Jesus is all-powerful, but we don't always think every minute of the day that Jesus really cares about us. Whereas here we see that Jesus was willing for this guy to be healed. He really cared about him. And remember, this guy was a leper, so he was the lowest of the low. He was an outcast in their society, but Jesus still cared for him. So don't let anyone fool you into thinking Jesus don't care for you or that you're not special enough. You know, you could be covered with growths all over your face, like this guy probably was, and he was special enough for Jesus to heal him. So even if no one ever talks to you and you feel like an outcast living outside the city, you can't go and hang out with other people because you're an outcast, even then, Jesus cares for you. But it's also important we don't reduce Jesus to just an emotional thing. Check it out. He's also a man of action, right? Jesus is a man of action. Check it out. In verse 3, it says, he stretched out his hand, he touched him, saying, I am willing, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So we've got all these actions going on here that show us that Jesus wasn't just someone who said, yeah, I love you, brother. But he was someone who actually got involved in people's lives. He actually intervened in people's lives and made a difference in their lives. So this could help us to understand that Jesus is someone who's here now with us and he wants to be involved in our lives rather than the fact that he's some distant force out there somewhere and that one day he'll come back and return, but for now he's not really going to do too much. You know, some people view the world as a wind-up toy. Yeah, some people think God wound the world up, then put it on the ground, and then the world goes, and one day the world will just stop ticking and then God will come back. As if God don't really care about the world, he just let it wind, and then he took a back seat. But when we see verses like this, it's hard to believe that, because here we see God coming into the planet and then putting his hands on people and healing them. So it seems that God does really want to be involved in our lives every day. So he's a man of action, and so it would make sense for us to pray each day that Jesus would intervene in our lives. Now, the other thing about Jesus here is that he fixes impossible problems. Jesus fixes impossible problems. Has anyone ever had an impossible problem in their life? Yeah, even the young ones, you see. And the good news is Jesus can fix those problems. Because we've already talked about how in biblical times it appears there was no known cure for leprosy. Now, if you've got a cold, you go to the doctor and they give you some drugs and it will clean up your cold. If you've got a broken leg, you go to the hospital and they fix your leg. But back in those days, if you got leprosy, the only solution was, right, you go away. You're outside the camp, stay away from everyone, don't touch anyone, we don't want them getting leprosy. And if you see anyone, quickly shout out, unclean, unclean, so that they know to not come near you. So this poor guy was in an impossible situation. And Jesus comes along and cures him, which shows Jesus can deal with impossible situations. You know, in biblical times, curing leprosy was seen as difficult as raising someone from the dead. Has anyone here ever raised anyone from the dead? Quite relieved, actually. If someone put their hand up, I might get a bit worried. Right. Yeah, it's pretty hard to raise someone from the dead. Now, check it out, right? In the Old Testament, in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 7, what's happened is the king of Aram has sent a letter to the king of Israel saying, will you cure my guy of leprosy, my guy Naaman? And this is what it says. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of this leprosy? So we see here, this guy is angry that he's been asked to cure someone of leprosy. And he says, can I kill people and bring them back to life? So that is how hard people viewed it to cure someone of leprosy. They didn't have hospitals and CAT scans and all the kind of things we've got these days. You know, instead they'd just be like, well, boy, I wouldn't be able to do this unless I'm able to bring someone back to life, so it's impossible. But Jesus fixes it. So I think the application here is when we find ourselves go through tough times and we think it's an impossible situation, can be like the leper and go to Jesus, be completely dependent on him and say, Jesus, if you're willing, you can help me. And have that attitude and know that Jesus does have the power to deal with it. Now let's see what happens next. Verse 4. Then Jesus said to him, see that you do not speak to anyone, but go show yourself to a priest and bring the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Now the first point I want to make here is that Jesus is not a genie. Okay, I know I kind of already said this before, but it's important we know Jesus is not a genie in a bottle. Okay, you don't pull out the cork, Jesus turns up and he says, you've got 3 wishes. And then your first wish is, I want another 3 wishes. And that's not how it works with Jesus, okay? Now, when he says to the leper, don't speak to anyone, there's been debate about what this means. I think it probably means he didn't want people to flock to him as if he was some magician, like some David Blaine type character who can do all these tricks. Because a lot of people would have just, if they'd heard from this leper what would have happened, they would have been like, great, well, I've got a wart on my finger, I wouldn't mind getting that removed. Someone else says, yeah, I've got a cyst just beneath my eye, I want that removed. And everyone's suddenly like, Jesus is this wonderful miracle maker who can fix all these nice problems for me. Maybe people even be like, I want an extension on my house. Can you just make it into being from nothing? You know, and people could have misunderstood what Jesus' mission was really about. So it could be that Jesus doesn't want people to misunderstand what he's come to do and just think that he's some kind of David Blaine type character. And knowing this can help us to have balance in our attitude to Jesus. We don't want to go to Jesus just as a genie in a bottle. I know that sometimes we only really go to Jesus when we're in trouble. But then when everything's good, we don't go to Jesus so much. So let's make sure we don't treat Jesus as a genie. It's good to go to him when we need healing, but it's good to also spend time praying when we don't need healing, to spend time reading our Bibles, because that's a good way to get to know Jesus, and to spend time obeying Jesus and serving Jesus. So, He doesn't want to be known as a genie, and then he gives the leper another command. He says, see that you do not speak to anyone, but go show yourself to a priest and bring the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. And I think this is showing us here that the law points to Jesus again. This is the last thing we're going to look at. Do you remember back in Matthew 5:17, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. And Jesus is saying, all the Old Testament law points to me. I fulfill it. Now, check it out. In Old Testament times, when a leper realized he had leprosy, right, they would have to go to the priest. The priest would look at their condition, and he would say, okay, you have to leave the camp now. You have leprosy. And remember, back then, leprosy involved a whole bunch of skin conditions. And he'd say, you've got to go because we don't want this to spread to other people. Now, it was in the law that if that leper later found he was cured, he could go back to the priest, and the priest would check him out and say, wow, you're cured. And they would do a ritual to let everyone know that this person was cured and could come back in the camp now. Okay? Now, the priest who checked out this particular leper probably wouldn't have ever expected him to come back, because healings of leprosy were really rare. They did happen a few times in the Old Testament, but they were proper rare. So this guy turns up now and says to the priest, imagine he goes to the priest and says, look, I've been cured. I've been healed. And the guy would say, how did you get healed? And he'd say, Jesus did it. This would then be a testimony to the priest that Jesus was the Messiah and that Messiah had come back. So it appears that Jesus here is using the law to show, look, it's me, I'm the Messiah, and I'm here. And the interesting thing is as well, Jesus is fulfilling a law that hardly ever would have been used. So it could be the priest in question would be like, that's why that law is there. I see now. Because you really wouldn't be expecting someone to turn up. Unless it was just a real mild skin condition they had and it just cleared up after a few weeks. But in this case where we think this was proper leprosy, a bit like Hansen's disease, if not Hansen's disease, you could imagine the guy would be shocked. So let's recap over what we've learnt today. Things we've learnt from the leper in the story. First thing, we've learnt that we should approach Jesus. Next thing, we should show complete dependence on Jesus. We should believe Jesus has the power to heal us. And we should submit to Jesus' will. These are the things we learnt from the leper. Now, if we look at what we've learnt from Jesus, we've learnt that Jesus touches even lepers. So it shows he's got compassion. And he wants to heal, which shows that Jesus cares. Jesus is also a man of action. He fixes impossible situations, but Jesus is not a genie. And finally, the law points to Jesus. So we can try and be more like the leper in many ways, and we can try and be more like Jesus too. And most importantly, as we focus on these truths here, we can understand Jesus better, know him better, and have a better relationship with Jesus. So I hope that's helped today to understand what our attitude to Jesus should be and what Jesus' attitude to us is. Any questions? All right, I'll just pray. Jesus, I thank you for your compassion and your love. I pray that you'd help us to understand that better. I pray as well for healing as well. I pray for my mum who's sick now, that you would heal her. Thank you, God, that Neil's been healed and that Helen's been healed. And I pray that you would continue to bring restoration to them, Lord God. Take away their pain, give them energy as they recover. Jesus, help us to be more like you and to reach out to people in our lives who might come across as lepers. Help us to not get too proud and to not forget that we're like lepers ourselves, and to not forget that. Thank you for your grace, Jesus. Amen.